Having a look at retail specifically outside of the grocery area, and I would say also outside of Amazon, because it's sort of its own sort of beast, if you like. John Webb, who's managing partner at Game Theory, lots of experience in the retail sector, ex-economist, well, current economist as well. But would love to hear your thoughts around what's going on in the retail sector outside of grocery, outside of Amazon, but also what should marketers in that sector be thinking about where, you know, shops are closed, or certain types of shops are closed in the US, of course. There are certain shops in different states that are still open. And if you're a retailer that hasn't really ramped up or invested in e-commerce prior to this pandemic heavily, you know, sort of what kind of advice can you give marketers in the retail sector?
Thanks, Claudia. Hi, everybody. Yeah, it's a bit of a battle for retail at the moment. When we were looking at the questions and thinking about how we'd go and answer them, we almost described ourselves as the bull and the bear, and I'm very much in the bear camp, I suppose. Certainly for retail, it's over the last month, it has been a battle. Claudia, you described the different stages that consumers went through earlier on. I think we've almost got to see the same thing from a retail perspective as well, where initially a lot of companies were almost determining whether or not they would remain a viable business over the next quarter. And I think we're through that, and thankfully we've not had too many casualties so far. But definitely, you look at the economic numbers. I mean, the Purchasing Managers Index for manufacturing and services, they came out earlier on in a month. They won't be a surprise to anybody, I don't suppose. You know, they've fallen off a cliff. We just had retail sales released either this morning, I think, or maybe yesterday morning for the UK. Retail sales down 5%. So that includes grocery as well as non-grocery, but grocery was reasonably well insulated. You know, at the end of the day, people have got to buy food, but certainly non-grocery retail outside of Amazon is a challenge. So I guess what to do? Well, the first thing to do is to ensure that you do remain viable, and that's establishing cash flow. So most companies have done that, and the mechanism by which companies have done that, of course, varies by market. In the US, that cash flow has been protected by issuing corporate bonds, you know, reasonable coupons. So JCPenney, AT&T, who we'll probably talk about later under telco, they've all gone to market. They've all raised quite, you know, significant levels of funds. AT&T, because they're more of a basic necessity, can get away with a coupon of 4%. Some of the retailers are offering 7 or 8%. But that funding is now in place, certainly in the US. And in the UK, we're seeing the loans come through from the banking sector, partially underwritten by the government, and that's a little bit slower to happen, but the funding is in place once a case can be made for that. So I think once you've gone through that stage and ensure viability, business viability, just almost stop and think that the business fundamentals haven't changed. You know, if you're offering a great product before at a price that consumers liked and at a price that makes you money, those fundamentals are still there. The demand is still there for most retail sectors. Now, in the service sector, sports entertainment, gyms, restaurants, that's a different tale altogether. But in like white goods retailing, computer retailing, hardware, home improvements retailing, the demand is there if it can be reached. So the business fundamentals are still relatively strong for now. What has changed is the way that you hit and reach those potential customers. And I think that's where the challenge is. And that's where perhaps we need to consider the media mix in a little bit more detail and use the full suite of paid, owned and earned. But it's not a reason just because, you know, the stores are closed. That's not a reason to pivot away from TV or video in general. It's a great way of reaching a huge proportion of the population of your target audience. So, you know, each retailer, each situation is different, but don't pivot away necessarily too strongly from what you were doing before, really. The situation becomes slightly less clear as we move further on into the future. We don't know how long government income protection schemes will last, and we don't know how long any recession that crops up will last for. We don't know whether there'll be a V-shaped recovery or whether it will be, excuse me, slightly more prolonged. But I think we can take some learnings. We're seeing some evidence in Spain that some restrictions are being eased. And I know Germany, some of the restrictions will be eased from next week as well. So for retailers in other markets, watch what happens in these countries very, very closely, because Germany and Spain are obviously pretty similar to the UK. That will give us a good feel for how things are going to pan out here. And again, in the US, slightly different situation in the way that stores reacted, and obviously each state is different. But again, learn from where those markets where they're slightly ahead of the curve and opening a bit earlier.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, John. And I guess a question for you on that, if when we sort of break down the categories in retail, so when we look at things like fashion versus, you know, for example, home improvement, I suppose, you know, with each one of those subcategories, we get different types of demand that are either being captured by the likes of Amazon or other retailers. Any views on these subcategories, sort of fashion and home improvement and the likes?
Fashion's tricky, isn't it? Because we've had a couple of fashion retailers go bust in the UK over the last few weeks. So it's obviously a difficult sector. And we also had the faintly comical BBC headline saying that British consumers are swapping fashion for alcohol, which is not necessarily the most helpful diagnosis of the problem, I guess. Look, some people will buy fashion online and they'll be happy to do that. And they will have been doing that over the last 2 to 3 years. Other people will see fashion as something that you need to go to store to try on, you know, sizes. I know myself, sizes vary from store to store. So I'm less likely to be fashionable, but equally I'm less likely to buy fashion accessories online. I'd prefer to go to store and see them myself. So I think it will be a slower recovery for fashion. Home improvement, again, in the UK, we've seen B&Q announce that they'll be opening their stores from next week. So they're already allowed to open because they're a hardware store that was defined as a key sector by the government. So different sectors, different levels of demand, and you just need to understand your own context very, very clearly. But I think that the thing to focus on, I mean, Matt touched on it earlier when we were talking about marketing. If you have a well-run and viable business with a solid cash flow, now is not the time to stop marketing. I'm not one of those who necessarily automatically believes in some kind of excess share of voice argument. And, you know, if you outspend your competitors, particularly in a recession, you'll grow X% more quickly than the others. I don't necessarily buy simple rules of thumb like that, but I certainly believe that you need to maintain a presence, to maintain awareness, to maintain consideration, and to maintain a link with your consumers. And by the way, when I say maintain a link with consumers, I don't mean change your creative to some of the frankly awful COVID-19 style creatives where we obsess on, you know, these are difficult times, these are challenging times, we're all in it together. I think I don't need to say anything more about that. If you need to see more, Mark Ritson has done a fantastic sketch on the whole topic, and I would urge you to look at his LinkedIn site for that. But if you had a good creative that was working pre-COVID and your business fundamentals are the same, then it will still work post-COVID. You might need to tweak it as the story evolves, but fundamentally, the overall creative shouldn't change dramatically.